Musa. He's currently the
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
He's currently the bail supervisor for the Bail Verification and Supervision Program for a Women's Prisoners' Rights Agency in Canada, making the linkages between the over-incarceration of Indigenous women and the national inquiry currently taking place in relation to the higher number of missing and murdered Indigenous women. He has also worked as a bail caseworker for a Women's Prisoners' Rights Agency, also dealing with the predominantly Indigenous men also over-incarcerated in Canada. He's a human rights public intellectual and activist. He's a Canadian of Palestinian origin and holds a Master's of Arts in International Law and Human Rights, focusing on Indigenous rights, making the connections between the plight of the Palestinians and the plight of the Indigenous people in Canada.
Wait a second. Oh, he's messing. Okay. Cool.
Okay, did you get that? Can everyone see my screen here?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so how's it going, everyone? Everyone's good?
Good.
Well,
Okay, I can't really hear very well, but maybe I'm not sure what's going on there, but I'm glad you guys can hear me clearly, right?
yes.
Okay. Welcome everyone.
Yep.
Thanks for attending. My presentation is going to be on the Indigenous peoples, anarchism, and the prison industrial complex within this framework of crime, security, and justice. So to start off, I just want to explain to everyone what the outline of the presentation is going to be. First, I want to demonstrate and explain the system that Indigenous peoples live under, which is settler colonialism, and the logics that are embedded in that system, and how it operationalizes against Indigenous peoples, all related to this topic that we're going to be discussing. And of course, I want to demonstrate the link of crime, security, and anarchism in relation to justice for Indigenous peoples under such a settler colonial system. And of course, I'd like to use the Palestinians and the Indigenous peoples of Canada as a comparative case study to make these links that we're going to be discussing. So I'm going to be pausing every time I change my slide because I think there's a bit of a delay. I think it's a 5-second delay when I change the slides, so just bear with me here when I pause. To start off, settler colonialism. What is that? It is a system that imposes privilege and domination on a particular group of people, and particularly it's Indigenous peoples. And it's what makes it unique is the fact that it relies on immigration and settlement to create statehood at the expense of Indigenous peoples. And of course, it operationalizes this domination and privilege through 6 logics that are embedded in the structural psyche of the state. So it's a settler colonial state that has 6 logics that make the state operationalized. And usually it's through law and policy, which I'll be explaining shortly. So the logics, there's 6 of them. The 6th one is usually a production of the 5. So you have the logic of elimination, which I'll be giving examples shortly. And then you have the logic of exceptionalism. And then you have the logic of expansionism. And then you have the logic of denial. And then you have the logic of racialization. And then all those 5 logics basically perpetuate a securitization reality for Indigenous peoples because of those 5 logics. So for example, to start off with the logic of elimination, it's basically the genocidal essence of the state, settler colonial state, where the state is in a constant attempt of incremental or very rapid genocide of Indigenous peoples. So for example, the Indian Act of 1876 and the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 in Canada. These are all laws that, the first one, the former, is basically subjugates Indigenous peoples in Canada under the federal government. So all affairs related to Indigenous peoples are run by the federal government. They don't have control of their own affairs. The Gradual Civilization Act justified what is called the residential school legacy here in Canada, which is very similar to what happened in the United States with the industrial schools. basically taking indigenous children from their parents, from their original lands, forcing them to go to school and learn a foreign culture, foreign language, cut them off from their culture, which is a cultural genocide. And then of course, you have the consequential effects of over-incarceration from criminality and deviance, which I'm gonna get into shortly. But when you have a whole generation of people, not only one generation, several generations of indigenous peoples collectively punished through these laws, of course you're gonna see high rates of incarceration, high rates of crime, because of the nature of what is going on from the settler colonial relation with indigenous peoples. And of course you have the same thing with the state of Israel against Palestinians, with the historical and contemporary ethnic cleansing policies and processes against indigenous peoples or the Palestinians. Of course, the latest being was the Special Rapporteur's report, Richard Falk's report of January 2014, where he actually called it bureaucratic ethnic cleansing. So what is going on in the Palestinian territories is bureaucratic ethnic cleansing as opposed to the physical ethnic cleansing that was that sort of started the process. There's now the bureaucratic, which is more hidden, you can't see it, and it's particularly going on in Area C of East Jerusalem. And then of course you have the logic of exceptionalism. You have the state's self-perception as being superior, with a higher morality in relation to its indigenous peoples. So you have the whole notion of the manifest destiny against the uncivilized savage that needs to be civilized, and therefore we need to put them in these schools. And it's the same thing with the state of Israel's stance with the Palestinians, that they're somehow the chosen ones. This was religiously promised. We have an entitlement to this over anyone else, so we're the only democracy in the Middle East. So it's that same logic of exceptionalism perpetuated in either the same or distinct forms. And then of course you have the logic of expansionism, which is basically the state's main focal point and driving force, which is the capitalist economic system, which requires territorial and economic expansion. The Canadian government was founded, the settler colonial state in Canada was founded by corporations, of course, the CP Railway and the Hudson Bay Company. They formed the state at the expense of indigenous peoples. Not only them, but the lands, of course, and their resources. And then, of course, you have, in the Palestinian scenario, you have the Jewish National Fund, and then the settlement expansion and corporations in the Palestinian territories. And actually, on that note, the latest human rights report, I highly recommend for people to read, of January 25th. It's called Occupation, Inc. It discusses the settlement expansion and the corporations in the Palestinian territories, and of which, of course, right now the UN has officially created a list of all the corporations that are operating in the territories. And of course, you have the logic of denial. This is where the state's attitude is, either willfully blind to the wrongdoing, or denies outright the consequential realities that indigenous peoples have to deal with as a result of this dehumanizing relationship between the settler colonial state and indigenous peoples. So, for example, there is this whole notion that, of course, the indigenous peoples were never there prior to the arrival of Europeans, that they were just discovered, and there was no such thing as genocide that went on. That was something of the past. We're now moving forward, we're progressive. There's no such thing as genocide, that, the indigenous people have so many rights. They're privileged, they have a lot of things secured for them by the state, but they never take advantage of them because they're, blah, blah, blah. They're either lazy, you have these old racialized explanations that are, perpetuating the same realities that they're trying to remove themselves from. And of course, you have the same thing with the Palestinians, saying that, Palestinians never existed, there's no such thing as Palestinians. These statements were made by former Prime Minister Golda Meir, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, and of course Republican candidate Newt Gingrich, who made similar statements. And then of course, as we have seen throughout what I've just been saying, of course this is also perpetuated by the logic of racialization, where you subhumanize and inferiorize indigenous peoples, always justifying all these acts because of perceiving indigenous peoples as somehow subhuman. So of course, you have the whole notion of that they're savages, uncivilized, and it's all the basis and essence of all these laws that are coming out by the settler colonial state. And of course, recently, even very recently, with Netanyahu's statements against the Palestinians as wild beasts, that they're dealing with wild beasts, of course, the whole racialization component of the settler colonial state. And of course, when you have all these logics operationalizing simultaneously against indigenous peoples, you have this, this drive by the settler colonial state to securitize indigenous peoples because of the very foundation of this relationship between the state and its indigenous peoples is one of a guilty conscience. And so when you're driven by a guilty conscience, you're never feeling safe. No matter how much you try to do, it's never enough to feel safe, and there's always this need and addiction to securitize the other to feel safe, but it never makes you feel safe because the foundation is one of a guilty conscience. And that's why you have this over-surveillance group of people, criminalized, securitized group of people, because of that foundation that I've been talking about. That whole foundation of the state was at the expense of indigenous peoples, and when that is not being addressed, you have this over-securitized population that is hurting both the settler colonial state and indigenous people, but in different ways. So you have, for example, indigenous peoples were banned from gathering because it was perceived as, somehow some form of resistance, or it's going to be a potential threat. They predominate the prison system because, of course, you have now a whole group of people who have lost their culture, their ways of life, have been abused from those schools that I was talking about. Mostly they've had physical violence and sexual violence, and of course that's what dominates the crime rates with indigenous peoples, is violent crimes. And so you have a whole group of people collectively punished and traumatized in a prison system, and that is the only way that the settler colonial state knows how to deal with the crimes that are committed against indigenous peoples, as opposed to facing the fact that the foundation of the whole relationship has been one of dishonor and disrespect towards its indigenous populations. And so you have an over-surveillance to a group of people, and it's the same thing with Palestinians, with the Israeli prisons, the over-surveillance, the blockading, the building of walls, the over-militarized society, but it never changes the fact that indigenous people's foundation has been one of a historical injustice, and the settler colonial society never feels safe until that historical injustice is adequately addressed. So where does the crime, justice, and anarchism link come in here? Well, in a lot of ways, anarchism is a very good way to look at an avenue against the injustice of the criminality of the relationship between the settler colonial state and its indigenous peoples. However, I'm going to get into why it's a limited lens, but it's still a helpful lens, but it's very limited when it comes to indigenous peoples. So it's helpful in the fact that, indigenous peoples, because anarchism, believes in the abolition of the state, and indigenous peoples, what's hurting indigenous peoples is the settler colonial state, and their self-determination is not confined to statehood, but it's rather about, nationhood and collectivity as a collective peoples. And it's the same thing with the Palestinians. When you look at the Intifada, for example, or uprising, that could be perceived as, or looked at from the lens of anarchism, that this is a protest against, this master controller, state that we're refusing to have, dictate our lives, and that civil society is in control of their destiny, if you may. And then, so the other thing is too, as well, is that the indigenous perspective to self-determination is one of a human right and not a state right. And that's also another good link to that. Sovereignty is not confined to statehood. And so the abolition of the state control, and restoring community and collective people's control is a very good way as well to see that link. So basically, if indigenous peoples have control of their own lives and their communities, it would restore justice for those communities, and restore that relationship that they have with the land that's been taken away from them, as opposed to having a settler colonial state control this group of people and their ways of lives. And then of course, as we see today, statehood is something that is sort of the new avenue for the Palestinians. It's gone from negotiations to recognizing statehood, and as much as there's limitations in what's been happening with the way that's been even recognized, because it's a non-binding scenario or solution for most of those states are recognizing that it's the two-state solution has become a dead solution for the Palestinian context. And this lens shows you a different solution, which is a solution where it's not confined to statehood, but rather it's about having indigenous peoples of the land control their own destiny, regardless of whether it's through without needing a state. Like, they could just have their relationship with the land restored, their right of return, the right to live in self-determination as a human right and not a state right. And now the limitations with the anarchism argument is the fact that it's still perceiving indigenous peoples from a colonial lens. So you're still trying to understand indigenous peoples or create solutions for indigenous peoples from a colonial theoretical framework. And what anarchism should be instead is the bridge from colonial theory to indigenous theory or indigenous worldview of perceiving their way of life. So it should be seen as a bridge rather than an obstacle. But it is limited in the fact that it is still a colonial way of perceiving indigenous peoples. So it is helpful, but it's still limited. And we should be cognizant of that and be cognizant of the fact that because of this limitation, we can still use it to bridge a solution as opposed to allow it to be an obstacle for understanding how to address the historical injustices faced by indigenous peoples, which is linked to criminality that we see, with indigenous peoples. They're overrepresented in all settler colonial states. This is the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the Palestinian context. They're over-incarcerated. You cannot say this is a coincidence. It's not something that is inherent with indigenous peoples. It's obviously a systemic problem, and this is why settler colonialism needs to be addressed. And anarchism is a very good lens to perceive, a solution, but we have to realize its limitations and use anarchism as an avenue for a way forward, as opposed to allowing it to perpetuate the problem. And of course, I've said these same things. Like, for example, another issue where anarchism becomes a problem is indigenous peoples believe in a creator, and then one could argue that, well, a creator is also saying that you have a master, and a lot of anarchist theory doesn't believe in that. That there's some kind of higher power that controls or has the ability to dictate your destiny. So this is where anarchism and indigenous spiritualism, which is the essence of indigeneity, this is another problem with perceiving indigenous peoples from the lens of anarchism, because it doesn't have that spiritual component, or it doesn't allow for the interdependent relationship that indigenous peoples have with, or they perceive with, that relational interdependence with everything around, including people, the earth, the sky, all things around us. They don't believe in that, so this is another issue as well. And that's where I end my topic, and I'm open for questions and answers. Questions?
Can you hear? Okay, go for it.
I can't hear, sorry.
I'm Hal.
Can you hear him?
Can you hear me?
Turn up
Yes,
your-
but it's
turn up your volume.
very faint.
Can you
want
turn
me
up
to
your
come and
volume?
get closer?
My volume is on max actually.
Okay.
Is this better?
Yeah, it's sort of okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Two things. First of all, I was wondering if you could comment, because one of the things that the Palestinian-Israeli relationship is talked about in terms of is religious difference. And Palestinians, being a Palestinian is often conflated with being Islamic, but is it not the case that prior to partition in 1948 that half the Palestinian population was Christian? And so we have a kind of a broader issue than the one that's been cast. The other thing, and then I'll let you respond, is just a thought from the session before, and where we talked about abolitionism. And much as I feel a kinship to what's called the penal abolition movement, I also have a sense of the meaning, the limitation of the meaning abolition. And it occurred to me that what you are talking about colonial rule is that it seeks to abolish indigenous peoples. So when you think about abolish and when you think about solutions, you think about destroying something rather than integrating it in. And so your presentation made me think of that too, that we're all ultimately, we can't really destroy the fact that each other exists, and somehow there needs to be an accommodation in between that won't be purely one thing or another. So thank you, I enjoyed the presentation, and please respond.
Thank you so much for your questions. These are very important questions, and my answers are the following. For the first one on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, yes, you're absolutely correct. That is the Zionist narrative that the Zionists want the world to see. They want the world to see the problem as a problem that is religious as opposed to a problem that is colonial. We're not fighting religion. They want the world to see that this is the hostile Muslims against, the Jews who are, claiming connection to the land, religiously justified. You have a colonial political agenda, religiously justified, which is what Palestinians are resisting, because Palestinians, prior to the creation of the State of Israel, Palestinians were not only Muslims, but there were, like you said, a huge majority of Christians and Jews as well, among other sects, very small sects that were there as well. So they're trying to, it's factual discrimination, okay? And this is important that we resist that kind of manipulation of narrative, because what it does is perpetuates and justifies the continuous ongoing oppression that the Palestinians are dealing with, including just lately, just even yesterday, confiscation of more land in the West Bank, and among other things. But this was just yesterday. They've given about, I can't remember how many people, I haven't really, just lost the numbers, but they've given 45 days for them to leave, or they're going to confiscate land. So there's incremental genocide that's going on, but is being silenced through these false narratives that are just distracting the world and make the world see the victim as the victimizer and the victimizer as the victim. And this is what's very, deadly, and this is very, very critical situation. And indigenous peoples are living exactly in that scenario, all across the board. And for your second question on abolition, what I would say is that, following what you mentioned, indigenous peoples had this agreement in Canada. I want to use this particular agreement for the reason. Reason is this agreement was called the Two-Row Wampum. What that was they signed a treaty between this Europeans who arrived here and themselves, which basically symbolized two vessels. One was a canoe and one was a ship. So the canoe was the indigenous, representing indigenous peoples, and then you had the ship, which was the settlers, sailing side by side on the same river. What does that mean? That means that you could share the same territory or land and live side by side without interfering with each other's ways of life. And so, going back to your context of abolition, indigenous people don't necessarily want to abolish the state, but rather they want to live in parallel with the state. They don't want to be part of the state, but they want to live, in parallel with the state, because the state and the idea of the state is not something that is, of their political culture. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily. It could. Maybe some indigenous people would want that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that abolition of the state is the sole requisite for indigenous peoples. And see, this is where anarchism is limited, because anarchism is all about the abolition of the state, as opposed to living as the whole notion of parallelism that indigenous peoples have and always sort of been advocating for. Does that answer all your questions?
Yes, sir, thank you.
Okay.
Any more questions? All right, thank you. We'll go to
Thank you
our
so much.
next speaker now. All right, so our next speaker is Colleen Hackett from Colorado State University. She's here to discuss white liberal feminism in the prison system. So Colleen Hackett is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Colorado State University in Pueblo. She facilitates a prisoner-led group called Webs of Support for those with history of intimate partner violence at a women's prison. She also co-edits a new publication by and for prisoners identifying as women, trans women, and gender non-conforming, entitled Unstoppable Publication.
Yes.
Sure.
Do you want the lights on, Colleen?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, bye on Good having you. Good.
All right, so thanks for having me, and thanks so much, Ahmed, for your work and your presentation.
Thank you so much. No, I appreciate it. Looking
really
forward to
important.
hearing everyone else's. So.
Yeah. So obviously, you heard what I'm presenting on white liberal feminisms and the prison system. I'm going to sort of pare down my presentation and try to get it in 20 minutes, just because of time constraints. But what I kind of wanted to first say is that my personal entree into this work is very much informed by my former stint in thanks so much. Yeah, I often don't disclose this actually, right? So I'm in the world of academia, and there's this sort of air that people have, right? And so I felt it important to sort of say it here, because so very much influenced me to go back to school, but also shaped the way that I understood how carcerality and how imprisonment shapes a person. I ended up going to graduate school to study rehabilitation systems and the sort of deficit model that we have in the United States, right, where people should address their thinking, right, and sort of change their mentality and their criminal thoughts in order to repair themselves, right? And so there was this constant sense of, you know, I'm wrong, there's something wrong with me, right? And in fact, you know, from the people I came to meet in prison, there was a wealth of intellect, amazing human resources, and solidarity, even in women's prisons with the liquor. And, you know, there's a little bit of that, but there's also great amounts of cohesion. And so, you know, when I started to go back to school, my research questions were really, you know, how is it that certainly we can dissect how the punitive arm of the state, right, imprisons people, polices people, and sort of represses them, but I'm also interested in how soft power is employed, right, through the prison system and through carceral systems of control, probation, parole, community corrections. And so I look at white liberal feminism as a sort of gate into that arena. And what is liberal feminism, right? It's the belief that female subordination is caused by cultural constraints. It's caused by bad laws that only think about men. And when I use men and women here, white liberal feminism often focuses on cisgendered folks, right? Thereby immediately excluding trans people. And so if female subordination is because of these legal constraints, let's say, then the solution for them is to fix the system, right? To go in and to just sort of tinker and to achieve gender equality through reform art. But the problems inherent to that, right, is working within existing power structures that perpetuate settler colonialism, that perpetuate trans misogyny and you know, heteropatriarchy and all those sorts of things. So this, you know, why it's, I call it a white liberal feminism, and other people do too, right, is that it emerges out of a particular feminist politic, right? What some would say is second wave feminism, and is something that sort of assumes a white middle class subjectivity, right? That is the baseline assumption, and laws are sort of crafted around that to protect that person. The other part of this tinkering is that, the other part of this white liberal feminism is that it's non-confrontational. So any fixes that they make, right, are sort of exported out to an intervening agent of the state, right? So for example, to address gendered violence, right? We know that that is a problem still in this country, all over the globe, right? And to fix that, right, we need nonprofits and victim advocacy groups, right? And so this charity model still exists to this day, and I'll talk about it in two ways that perpetuate the prison system directly. So the first is the sort of anti-rape movement, or, you know, battered women's movement. And then the second one is gender responsive justice, which is more central to my work. So the first one, the anti-rape movement, right, just to give you some stats, I mean, it's quite horrific to think about. 85% of girls in the US report having experienced sexual harassment in school. Right? These are minors, and that's significant. 1 in 5 women about have experienced sexual assault, but that varies depending upon the community you're looking at. When you're looking at students on a college campus, 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted. When you're looking at indigenous women, 1 in 2. 1 in 2, we're at 50%, right? Horrible. 1/3 of women have experienced domestic violence. 1 in 4 women have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. Trans women of color have the highest murder rates out of any LGBTQ group. And so with this anti-rape movement, they sought to champion state solutions, right? State-guided criminal legal system solutions to the problem. So that resulted in anti-sexual assault legislation, right? Let's be more tough on people who perpetuate sexual harm, vis-a-vis prison sentences. Also, mandatory arrest laws, right, for domestic violence. So when cops are called out to a domestic violence scene, right, they have to arrest, depending upon the jurisdiction, they have to arrest at least one person, if not both, if it's a two-party dispute. And so these are mechanisms, again, the Violence Against Women Act, that first operate on a politics of protectionism that isn't inclusive at all, right? So by using the prison system and policing systems to intervene, there's a safety that is promised, and that safety that is promised is to people who believe that police are there to support them and to help them and to protect them, right? So there's that problem, and it's systematically set up to disadvantage people who are not white or not white assimilated, right? Or who don't have middle or upper class stature, economics, whatever. It's the fantasy of safety, right? And this fantasy of safety is provided to those people who, are more advantaged, class advantaged, race advantaged, gender advantaged, etc. Okay, and the second way in which white liberal feminisms prop up and support the prison system, and indeed, I argue, accelerate it, is through gender-responsive justice. So gender-responsive justice came out of feminist criminology, an area of study that I'm very well acquainted with. I learned it from one of the elders, the founders of the discipline. And it was that, hey, listen, when we look at the women who are channeled into the prison system, we're looking at extremely high incest rates, sexual assault rates in childhood and adulthood, high physical assault rates, all that. And so we have to sort of address that, right? And gender-responsive justice says that the prison system is meant to deal with male offenders. And so, since that is the case, they're not equipped to deal with the high levels of trauma that women are carrying with them into this setting. So how can we sort of bring equality into the prison system, right? Because again, liberal feminisms are about achieving equality, and so this form of, I think, distorted equality is that we provide more programs in prisons, right? More therapeutic programs. We sort of, do all that we can to decrease the trauma of women on the inside, have more female guards on staff, etc. And this is also leaking out into community corrections as well, right? Okay, great, we found the solution, right? If we sort of have more social workers on board and more people who are trauma-informed and providing that sort of care, then we can provide it for people on probation and parole and etc. And I've, done an intensive ethnography of one particular site that provides rehabilitation for women who are criminalized and formerly imprisoned. And quite frankly, if women don't achieve a certain cultural model, right, of a well-behaved, not biblical woman, but, a sort of well-behaved, docile subject, then they're more likely to pass. And if they don't, if they're resistant, if they're, quote-unquote, blaming people outside of them instead of looking inside to see, wait, why am I still sad about trauma? Why am I still resorting to sex work when I don't have money, right? These are the sorts of things that continue to enact violence upon oppressed communities, right? The state inherently is violent, and so appealing to formal criminal legal sanctions to correct behavior or to fix people, again, is perpetuating that violence. Now, the consequences of this are that obviously we strengthen these institutions that perpetuate colonialist notions of progress, but also patriarchal notions of progress. But they're also unresponsive to the grassroots, right? And so they continue, white liberal feminists and those frameworks continue to operate within a system that maintains social hierarchies. And so there's this great scholar, Martha Escobar, and she has a book coming out about immigration detention centers. And she says that, you know, prisons and, well, detention centers specifically are sites of reproductive control, right? And so if, you know, in the mainstream, right, we see that reproductive justice is a constant topic among feminists, liberal feminists. If we are to be concerned with that very thing for women, or women-identified people, then we need to look at how immigration detention centers split up families, right? How they prevent women from getting pregnant while on the inside. Or we can look at the more egregious case in California prison system, right? Where they coerced sterilization upon women between the years of 2005 to 2011. It's very, very recent. The official numbers are that I think just under 50 women were forcibly sterilized. You know, they were sort of, you know, dragged to these rooms and sort of pressured with this paperwork to sign off and consent to these procedures that many of the women said afterwards they weren't fully aware of. And they found out, oh, I just had my tubes tied, right? And we're talking about poor women, we're talking about victimized women, we're talking about women of color, right? Gender non-conforming women, or people rather. So it's interesting that part of the violent structure of the prison system is ignored in white liberal feminisms. Another thing that's ignored is the various kinds of violence that is enacted upon women. So they're very much narrow and limiting in their definitions. They want to focus on private acts of violence, right? Particularly when we think about the battered women's movement. What is violence, right? Violence is when a man hits his partner in the home, usually, or when a father sexually assaults his daughter, and so on. Now, these events are definitely atrocious. They're catastrophic to people's lives, but what of the sort of public violence that happens to people, right? How does that enter the conversation? And I argue that it doesn't, right? When we look at violence against sex workers, or the huge, you know, the trafficking, right, sex trafficking things that we're trying to intervene in right now, what is the solution? It's sort of this default, let's, you know, intervene through policing structures and through the criminal legal system. Additionally, undocumented immigrants experience violence in their everyday lives, not only because they cannot rely or say, report that they cannot rely on formal criminal legal sanctions or calling the police, but they're also constantly worried about La Migra, right? The ICE. And so, you know, they've come to sort of accept this level of predictable violence into their lives because they are forced to, because these structures don't account for their lived realities. So again, this is to say that they're, white liberal feminisms make a distinction and you know, vilify private violence, and this all hinges on who the perfect victim is, right? Who can sort of achieve this ideal definition of victimhood. And so I'll conclude on this note. In terms of, you know, how we push forward, I'm not here to necessarily talk about what abolition looks like, although I have ideas, but I do know that our notions of safety or of freedom or of reproductive justice or any of these things should not hinge on making others unsafe and unfree. So when we think about militarized borders, right, it's to protect some in the country and to exclude anyone else who's not in the country. And when we think about the prison system, again, when we think about gender oppression, right, all of these sorts of structures, again, that operate on the backs of a majority to privilege a minority. And so I will end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we don't have our last speaker?
So we can have questions for Colleen if she wants questions.
Okay. Yeah.
You have plenty of time because we don't have a third speaker, I believe, right? Is that correct?
No, these are the only two
Oh, I
speakers.
thought Charles
So,
showed up.
no,
Okay.
Charles didn't show up, so you have questions, and then at 1 o'clock, of course, a little wrap up, and then we'll do a big picture around futurality, and then
This helps.
Thanks for mentioning white liberal feminism, but there are other feminisms too, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking in particular, what gets called radical feminism, where patriarchy is the issue. So how about that, the idea that, and even among criminologists, I had a dialogue at one point with other feminist criminologists. I consider myself a feminist criminologist too,
Yes.
but it's a different kind of feminism. You want to speak to that?
Right, about radical feminism?
Or just about the different feminisms of color as well as white and
Yeah, the conversation is certainly changing in academic circles, and you can perhaps speak a bit better to the evolution of that, but I have been inspired, right, by the acceptance of critiques of the status quo feminism that has been business as usual, and the adoption of, intersectionality theory, right, or different kind of critical race theories. And so I think that is a step in the right direction. However, I do think that the tinkering with the criminal legal system, with the prison system, has so very much still hinged on these status quo dominant feminisms. And so, what would happen if we started bringing intersectionality into the prison system? I still don't think, that I think that they have the ability to sort of, absorb this rhetoric of inclusion while still, perpetuating violence and oppression in a different sort of way. So, I'm happy that thinkers are incorporating these kinds of thoughts, but I do want to see how we can learn from social movements a bit more in this regard, and think about alternative, justice models, which I think people are promoting. So we'll see.
I was just thinking that some people would say that white liberal feminism predominates in U.S. culture, so that it's goes along with the individualism that's in our culture and so forth too, so that it's particularly prominent in this part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Michael?
As you know, I really, really like this thing that you're onto. I think that, I say as you know because a colleague and I are editing 3 issues, special issues for 3 different journals on penal abolition, and Colleen has submitted this as an abstract, and she's in one of the issues, and my co-editor and I are very excited about her work. When I read your abstract or listened to you talk about your work here, I think it's incredibly powerful in terms of what it's going to bring to the conversation of penal abolition. Because I think any one of these feminisms, you could look at any one of these feminisms and look at the carceral system and see what, and add important conversations about what we're doing and what we're not doing. just to bring up one example, the one that you just mentioned, about, sort of the looking from, the white liberal feminist perspective at the expectation that exists in the prison that women behave, right? In the white woman sense, not quite, as you said, as far as the biblical woman, but just in terms of the everydayness of that's out there. And I think it's taking, I think you could spend the rest of your career really looking at all these different feminisms and what kind of light they shed onto how we operate in terms of our justice, and especially, what their contribution can be to folks trying to think in completely different ways. I think it's just very, very powerful stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Especially because I'm very, very nervous because there are some intelligent people in this room. It always makes me flustered.
Appearances can be deceiving.
Yeah, how from
And
the
to-
people I know.
To sort of tie it back to Ahmad's, again, great presentation, there's some great indigenous feminism, school of thought coming out, particularly from Canada, which I appreciate, but also the US. And I think that could certainly, help sort of, break us out of this alienating, individualized politic, right, that has, plagued American politics, or US politics rather, for a long, long time, so.
I wonder if Ahmed has any reactions. He's been sitting quietly. Ahmed, do you have anything to say?
Hold on,
You're
hold on, I
not-
can't hear you, wait.
There we go. You're up now.
Can you hear us? Yeah?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering what is being done. What is being done in relation to? Because here women have to be handcuffed and ankle cuffed when they're giving birth in prison. What is being done about that in the United States? Just wondering if there's any kind of move. I'd like to know more about the movement, on that.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. So currently in the United States, there are, I believe it's now 10, but I haven't followed the recent legislation, 10 states that do not allow shackling during pregnancy. That means 40 still allow it. In Colorado, I know the statewide movement here has been successful as of 2010 in ending that practice, and that was spearheaded by a nonprofit in Denver by queer Latina lawyers who are interested in birth justice. They go under the name of the Elephant Circle. That's the name of the organization. In terms of a national movement, I actually am not familiar, but you could certainly ask Indra at Elephant Circle because she would be very well informed on the matter.
Sure. Maybe pass me your contact information so we could just
Sure.
discuss after. Yeah, because it'd be interesting to get some kind of legislative framework that we could, maybe learn from and use here in terms of addressing this problem as well. So I'd just like to look at some of the ways that that's out there. So there's lots to learn from a lot of people. So it'd be good to exchange ideas, right?
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
So just please send me your contact info. It'd be good. We can exchange. Yeah, awesome.
Speaking of that, I was wondering if
Presentation,
you could ask
fantastic.
organizers to send a list of contact information for us as participants.
Sure.
Because I'd like to stay in touch too.
You just missed that, but we're going to hopefully share amongst all presenters all of our contact info.
Contact info.
Okay, awesome.
No other questions?
Okay,
Great,
thanks so much.
thank you.
All right, bye, Ellen.
Bye.
Hmm?
That's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
You want to ask? I will respectfully hand you.
I respect some ceremony.
Very good. Very good. Closure is
And besides, I might come back to